William Bushnell Stout wasn't your typical car designer. In fact, he wasn't even a car guy to begin with. He was an aviation pioneer, a man obsessed with the future, with speed, with breaking rules. And when someone like that decides to build a car, you don't get something normal. You get something like the Stout Scarab, strange, bold, and decades ahead of its time. Before he ever touched an automobile, Stout was already reshaping how people thought about transportation. He worked with Henry Ford, helped develop all-metal aircraft, and had this radical idea that the same principles used in airplanes, lightweight materials, aerodynamic forms, centralized structures, could change how cars were built too. And here's the thing, he wasn't wrong. He just might have been too right too early. Stout believed the future of cars wasn't about chrome or horsepower. It was about space, comfort, and efficiency. He dreamed of a vehicle that felt more like a lounge on wheels than a noisy metal box. A car where families could stretch out, swivel around, and travel in peace, long before anyone ever said the word minivan. But when you mix an aviation engineer's mindset with a 1930s car market stuck in its ways, you're bound to create something that turns heads, and not always in a good way. And what he built next would confuse, inspire, and horrify the public all at once. When the Stout Scarab first rolled into public view in the mid-1930s, most people didn't know what to make of it. It looked like something from another planet, or at least another century. While other cars still clung to long hoods, exposed fenders, and decorative chrome, the Scarab tossed all of that aside. It was smooth, wide, and unusually flat-faced, like an alien beetle cruising through a sea of boxy sedans. But that bizarre shape wasn't just for shock value, it was intentional. The Scarab featured a rear-mounted Ford flathead V8, freeing up the front of the vehicle and completely altering its proportions. It also had no running boards, which in the 1930s was almost unthinkable. And unlike the typical ladder-frame cars of the time, the Scarab used an aluminum unibody construction, an innovation so advanced that most automakers wouldn't catch up for decades. Step inside, and the weirdness continued, in the best way. Instead of a bench seat crammed against the dashboard, passengers found a spacious interior with lounge-style seating, movable chairs, a fold-up table, and no hump in the floor. It was open, roomy, and shockingly modern, more like a hotel lobby than a car cabin. The idea was to make the car a mobile living space, long before campers, RVs, or even family road trips were really a thing. William Stout didn't just want to build a new car, he wanted to reinvent how people experienced travel. But while engineers and futurists were intrigued, the average buyer was confused. The Scarab didn't look right, and in a world where cars were status symbols, that mattered more than function. Still, under all that ridicule, something revolutionary was taking shape. Long before Chrysler ever coined the term minivan, the Stout Scarab quietly checked all the boxes. Flat floor? Check. Rear engine for extra space? Check. Flexible, lounge-like seating? Absolutely. If you squint past the Art Deco curves and 1930s styling, what you're really looking at is the ancestor of every soccer mom's favorite vehicle. But here's what made the Scarab so far ahead of its time, and also, what made it fail. It was likely the first car to use a full unibody structure made of aluminum. At a time when cars were bolted together like scaffolding on a train, this was unheard of. It made the vehicle lighter, stronger, and smoother to drive. In theory, this should have been a game-changer. In practice, nobody knew what to do with it. And then there was that rear-mounted Ford flathead V8. It wasn't the most powerful engine around, but placing it in the back freed up the cabin and gave the car a completely different layout. With no transmission tunnel running through the floor, passengers could move around like they were in a train car, not a cramped sedan. But while the mechanics were innovative, the styling was polarizing. Some saw a streamlined masterpiece. Others saw a bloated insect. Either way, the public wasn't ready. It was too different, too strange, and the world wasn't exactly begging for a minivan in the middle of the Great Depression. Still, the blueprint was there, decades before the concept would go mainstream. But as groundbreaking as the design was, Stout made one strange decision that might have doomed it from the start. But the name, Scarab, played a bigger role in the car's downfall than you'd expect. William Stout named his creation after the Egyptian dung beetle, a creature famous for rolling balls of waste across the desert. Not exactly the kind of association you want for a brand new, futuristic car. Back then, names carried weight. They hinted at status, elegance, or power. The Scarab's name, while mysterious, also felt off-putting. People weren't quite sure whether to be intrigued or disgusted. The image of a beetle pushing dung probably didn't inspire thoughts of luxury or innovation. Some say the name reflected Stout's fascination with ancient symbols and mythology. But in the world of marketing, the Scarab was a misstep. It was hard to sell a car when the first thing people imagined was a bug, and not even a glamorous one. The car's odd shape only added fuel to the fire. Critics mocked its flattened face and wide, bulbous body. Journalists called it ugly and a rolling eyesore. Dealers struggled to find buyers. Even those interested in its advanced engineering hesitated to associate themselves with something so unusual. In a market where image was everything, the Scarab's name and looks became a double-edged sword. It was innovative, yes, but also a tough sell for the average consumer, and that confusion over image was just the beginning of the Scarab's tough road. In the end, the Stout Scarab was never meant to be mass-produced, but even by experimental car standards, its numbers were astonishingly low. Only 9 Scarabs were ever built, a tiny fleet that barely made a ripple in the automotive world. Why so few? For starters, the Scarab was outrageously expensive. Each one was handcrafted, using lightweight aluminum and cutting-edge techniques that drove the price far beyond what most people could afford, especially during the Great Depression. It wasn't just a car, it was practically a rolling prototype. Add to that its radical design, which scared off buyers looking for something familiar and reliable. People weren't ready to trade their traditional sedans for a vehicle that looked like a spaceship mixed with a beetle. Even dealers struggled. Finding customers willing to pay a premium for something so strange proved nearly impossible. The Scarab became a niche vehicle for the wealthy and adventurous, rather than a practical family car. With such limited production, Stout's dream of revolutionizing transportation fell flat. The car was too costly, too weird, and way too early for the market. But despite selling less than a dozen units, the Scarab left a footprint that would echo through automotive history. While the Stout Scarab vanished from the roads almost as quickly as it appeared, its impact quietly rippled through automotive history. Though the public rejected it, designers and engineers couldn't ignore what Stout had pioneered. The Scarab was, in many ways, a visionary blueprint. It introduced concepts that wouldn't become mainstream until decades later. Things like unibody construction, flexible interior layouts, and rear-engine designs that maximize cabin space. Minivans, MPVs, and even some camper vans owe a surprising debt to this quirky, misunderstood machine. Its lightweight aluminum body predated the industry-wide shift to lighter, stronger materials. The Scarab showed the potential for cars to be more than just transportation. They could be comfortable, spacious living spaces on wheels. In fact, some historians argue that if the market had been ready, the Scarab might have reshaped the entire auto industry much earlier, changing how we think about family cars and utility vehicles. Yet, because it was so ahead of its time, the Scarab became a footnote, buried under layers of criticism and indifference. Still, its spirit lived on, quiet, stubborn, and impossible to ignore for those who knew where to look. But what about the few Scarabs that survived the decades? They have stories of their own. Out of the 9 Scarabs ever made, only a handful still exist today, treasured relics of an era that dared to dream differently. These cars have become priceless collector's items, symbols of innovation wrapped in an unforgettable, if awkward, package. One of the most famous Scarabs was fully restored and showcased at prestigious events like Pebble Beach, where car enthusiasts marvel at its bold design and engineering ahead of its time. For some, it's a beautiful oddity. For others, a glimpse into what might have been. Despite its reputation as the ugliest car in the world, the Scarab has slowly been reevaluated. Design experts now recognize it as a pioneer, a bold experiment that challenged conventions and paved the way for vehicles we take for granted today. But the Scarab's story isn't just about cars. It's about vision, courage, and the price of being too far ahead of your time. And while most people have never heard its name, the Scarab's legacy quietly lives on, reminding us that innovation often arrives wrapped in strange, unexpected packages. The Stout Scarab was mocked, dismissed, and forgotten by most. To many, it was just an ugly, awkward oddball, too strange to be loved, too expensive to be practical. But beneath its unusual shape and quirky name lay a vision that was far ahead of its time. It challenged everything people thought a car should be, planting the seeds for future innovations like the minivan, unibody construction, and spacious, flexible interiors. In a way, the Scarab wasn't just a car, it was a glimpse into the future that few were ready to see. Sometimes, being first means paying the price of failure. But the Scarab story reminds us that innovation often wears a strange mask at first, and that what's rejected today can become the foundation for tomorrow's breakthroughs. So next time you see a minivan rolling down the street, remember the car that came before it, a bold, ugly, misunderstood machine that dared to rewrite the rules and change the course of automotive history, whether the world realized it or not.